So let's open up this, and we have about 15 minutes to ask questions. I'll bring that up for the next group. Thank you. So that you can mic up. So we'll go ahead and open this up, and I'll moderate. And if you have a question, if we're a small room, I think you can just stand, but I'd like to hear your name and where you're from. So let's go with questions. Well, I might open one up that I had as a moderator, and it was slide 10 of Bill's talk. And so when it's not about the money. I
remember it very well.
So it's not about the money, it's about the money. It was about the subcontracting.
Yeah.
So can you tell us about where the bite happens with the indirects, with the F&As? So, you know, they come to the prime site, and then where the F&As go from there?
That's always a difficult question. So basically, it goes, things will go to the site. Let's say you're the PI. It would come to you at IU. You would have some contracts with us. You'd pass that money to us. So the money from Michigan would go, for the most part, to pay the sites. Now, it might be that if you had IU as a site too, you might pay them directly out of your budget. But basically, we would pay most of the rest of them out of the CCC. We track, there's milestones for payments for all the studies. Those are tracked in WebDCU, and so we know when things are done and when people are due for payment. We can get invoices scheduled there. The money that gets passed through to the sites usually there might be various sorts of payments might go to the sites. There might be startup funds, and those will be a variable amount depending on what needs to be done. There might be costs that are allocated for exception from informed consent if it's an EFIC trial. There might be some other things that are thrown into there. It just depends on the trial. But the majority of things are going to be for the per patient costs. So we have master agreements with all of the hub sites. So the CCC will establish a master agreement with all the hub sites. And so when new trials are added, you don't need to have a new contract. You just have an amendment to an existing contract. And basically the money, what we try to do when we compute those per patient budgets is a lot of effort goes into this. Dave Wright can attest to this, having run Protect before, but we talk a lot to investigators, study coordinators, et cetera, and look at what's involved and what's a reasonable budget for this trial. We bake indirect costs into the per patient payments. So if the per patient payments, they're inclusive of indirect costs. So if a site is getting $10,000 a patient, for example, that's inclusive of indirects. There's not indirects that are attached on top of that. I think that's about as much detail as I'm going to go into.
Yeah, I think that answers it. In other words, there's not some super fund for everybody's F&As. You're going to take it out of what you get paid per patient. So.
And I might mention one thing too. You know, a lot of places, what we found in the net for sure, is that a lot of places say, oh, you know, our institution is always going to charge us 54% or 72% or whatever your indirect cost rate is, and a lot of people think that's written in stone. It's not written in stone. There's lots of ways to negotiate those, and I would say easily, you say, Rob, probably at least 2/3 of the sites, if not 3/4 of them, were able to get different indirect cost rates on there through negotiation with their institutions.
I think Alex, you had a question.
Hi, Alex came from Duke University. You mentioned on the last slide that Patrick is a planning grant. I understood that a planning grant is not a pilot trial. It is to do the organizational activity. So does that mean that the SIREN network should be preparing to enroll patients with some massive fees, or is the output of that grant going to be sort of a protocol and a methods paper and that sort of thing?
Well, I think I'm pretty well qualified to answer that.
Any of the panel can respond.
So since I went through it, there's 2 planning grants that are out. One of them is an XO1 that has no money with it, and the other is a U34, which has about $120,000 associated with it. It's a 1-year grant. And these are just simply planning grants. The way I'm doing it is I pitched to do the statistical design, and like a lot of things, I mean, we did like 90% of the statistical design and, you know, sent it to them, and we're going to ask for money to do the other 10% type of thing. And then the other is to go out and survey all the sites and find out whether they can do things like cardiopulmonary function testing 6 months later, and what's their tolerance or thought process on EFIC for enrollment, which has never been done for a pulmonary embolism study. But it's about planning as opposed to an R34, which is, asking that one question, like might be, can we enroll patients with submassive pulmonary embolism? So two different mechanisms, the U versus the R, so those don't conflate or confuse those.
And I would say, even though we included this, Rob included this as far as SIREN grants, this is not a SIREN grant. This is not the SIREN network. I mean, we talked with Jeff, we had a lot of discussions about whether or not we were ready to design a randomized clinical trial, and we decided, gosh, we really have, maybe there's better ways to do this, and so this is preliminary to that. So it's not officially SIREN, although there's certainly a lot of SIREN input on it.
Yeah, and I guess the other thing that does play into the SIREN component with this, though, is that as SIREN has the vision of having adaptive clinical trials, we recognize that creates a new burden. So adaptive clinical trials, to get the operating characteristics of those trials and understand them and design them well, requires extensive simulation. And the extensive simulation that's required to plan those things is more complicated, more expensive, and takes longer than how trials have traditionally been planned from a statistical standpoint. I actually think that a lot of that is not unique to adaptive trials, and in fact would be useful for traditional trial designs as well, and it helps people understand how their trial will react to various circumstances that they might not have anticipated. So very often we end up with a traditional clinical trial that ends up with an unexpected event rate or a change in time, a secular trend that affects the outcome, and we all go, wow, who would have expected that? But there was a way to think about that, there was a way to test that, there's a way to know how the trial would respond to that and protect against it in the design phase, but it takes more time, more effort, and more scholarly activity, and so there's probably a greater need for planning grants to do a lot of the things that we'd like to do in SIREN. So maybe I shouldn't have included Hetrick as a SIREN thing, but I sort of see having sent you back to do the planning grant as SIREN's responsibility.
And the DCC, a co-PI is a member of the DCC.
Yeah.
So, Sharon Yates.
Hi, I'm Moyer from the University of Michigan.
Any other questions?
Yeah. Is there any real question? Okay. So you said that you don't provide feedback on the science, sort of. The PI has carte blanche.
No, he didn't say that.
Okay. Well, then maybe
we don't direct the science.
We don't provide a layer of peer review. Right. You don't have to pass our peer review.
But is that the same as no comment on the science? Or because it certainly sounds like one of the pieces of feedback here was, boy, you should really do a planning grant to develop that. Or was that really an operations piece rather than a science piece? Is that your question?
Yeah, and I guess the other part of it is, can we talk more about my oxygen deprivation stuff?
Yeah. So I mean, I don't think that. I mean, I think that we offer feedback on the science for sure, right? I mean, so I mean, we've got a lot of experience in clinical trial design, and we want to share that experience. What we don't want to be is a hoop that you have to get through. We want to be someone who will work with you to help you design the best possible grant application and conduct the best possible trial. But you don't have to get our approval on the science. We will offer feedback on the science. Well, the only thing we have to approve is that it fits for the network.
But having done it, maybe I just offer my perspective. I've found them to be agnostic experts. I brought them this idea, and they listened to the data and to the papers that I knew about. I presented it to them. They told me their ideas about what they thought, how it should go, and then made a strategic recommendation. And it was a lot different than, well, the strengths of this and the weaknesses of this. They said these are options and helped me design a strategy. So I would say it was collaborative. That would be my description.
And I think that's really the idea. And I think I'll give an example from a previous trial without naming the trial. So where we might come in is that, this trial had a certain parameter. They were saying, well, this is going to be the cut point. And so we brought up that you sure that's the cut point? Maybe the cut point is lower. Maybe the cut point is higher. Should we look at some other aspects of this to really know? Or are you really sure that's where the cut point is? So we weren't trying to tell them you need to look at another cut point. We said, do you want to think about this? You know the science. Do you think that's valid that we should be looking at a different cut point? And the answer in that case was no. We know what it is. Fine. Okay. We'll live with that. But that's the kind of advice we would give on the science without saying you need to have a different cut point. That would be the different thing.
Say, Brian, you went through this in Tucson, but again, the mechanism for ancillary studies to the existing studies, like how to.
So I know Jeremy had to run off to get a flight, but oh, you're there. Oh, you're up. So I think if you're talking about mechanisms for ancillaries, you might be better able to answer this. NINDS used to have an ancillary FOA. They don't anymore. I don't know about NHLBI, but the institutes are always interested in ancillary trials that are scientifically important, and if they don't come in on an ancillary FOA, then they come in under the exploratory trial FOA that's out there.
And I guess, what would you say about the perspective of a PI who comes in with an idea? She wants to do an ancillary trial. I guess the mechanism to get into it would be exactly the same as for a primary trial, right? That you would go that way.
Yeah, and I'd say philosophically, the message we were given very clearly 10 years ago when we started, and I still hear clearly today, is that the institutes are less interested in sort of what happened 20 years ago, which was whenever someone came in with a clinical trial grant, they came in with a clinical trial grant that had 5 or 6 specific aims and had all these sort of ancillary studies sort of built into the original trial grant, and it was very hard to review because a lot of times it made the ancillaries made the trial twice as expensive, and the reviewers would like the core question, but they didn't like the ancillaries, which they saw as loading on. And so the strategy that we were told is you design your clinical trial to answer the key clinical questions that your trial is designed to answer, and then have ancillary trial ideas come in as their own supplemental grants, which I think is usually good for the investigators too, when it's a outside investigator who gives them the ability to.
And I would say that just to add to that a little bit, and I'm not sure where the question was coming from specifically, Brian, but we would like to be able to have some ancillary grants planned for most of the trial, because I think for most of them it's probably appropriate, right? So that would be something that would be very important, and the usual thing would be to approach probably that trial team, with some ancillary ideas, and the sooner the better. And you don't need to be constrained by, for example, and I'll use Boost as an example. So Boost is going to be funded by NINDS. It's going to be paid for by NINDS, but there's an ancillary grant that's going to get, hopefully, funded by DOD to do a biomarker study that's affiliated with the Boost study. So it doesn't even have to go through the same NIH mechanism necessarily.
I think the key parameters for ancillaries are that they not interfere with the parent, right? So they can't be a threat to the parent grant, and they're usually going to be multiple layers checking that that's the case, multiple layers of oversight, and then usually to the extent that it's efficient, that it doesn't add on too much extra work, right? So the more new data that you have to collect and new tests and new outcomes that you need to generate for that ancillary, the more challenging that ancillary becomes. Not impossible, but the ancillary that fits in within the context of what's already being done is usually the most efficient.
Okay. All right. With moving right along so we can stay on time, if there's no other burning questions, I'm going to turn moderation over to my able colleague, Josh Goldstein. I'm going to excuse myself to go watch a mentee deliver a poster, if I may. It's an important thing to me.
All right, so let's just take a moment to thank everybody for the first round.